In 2006, an entire third-grade class vanished during a lockdown. 19 years later, their desks were found arranged in a perfect spiral. The demolition crew supervisor, a man named Marcus Cole, felt the air change first. One moment, the rhythmic crunch of machinery tearing into the old Northwood Elementary. The next, a stillness that settled heavy and wrong. His radio crackled. One of his men, a young guy named Leo, sounded breathless, almost spooked. Leo said, "Boss, you need to see this. Down here, what could be so urgent?" Marcus had seen all sorts during demolitions, old-time capsules, forgotten storage, nothing that made a seasoned worker sound like he'd seen a ghost. He navigated the churned earth and broken concrete, heading towards the school's west wing, or what was left of it. The main structure was already a skeleton, but they were now excavating the foundation, preparing for new construction. Leo stood at the edge of a newly exposed cavity, a dark gash in the ground where the earth-moving equipment had snagged and pulled away a huge slab of old concrete. It wasn't on any of the blueprints. "What is it?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing slightly against the raw earth. Leo just shook his head, pointing down. The air that rose from the opening was cold, unnaturally so for a summer morning in 2025. It smelled of dust, deep and ancient, and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling. Marcus peered into the hole. A rough-hewn ramp of debris led downwards. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from his belt. "Stay here," he told Leo, whose face was pale beneath a layer of grime. He carefully made his way down, the beam cutting through the darkness. The space opened up into a room, surprisingly large. It was undeniably man-made, but crude. The walls rough concrete, the floor packed earth. And then, he saw them. Desks. Small wooden desks, the kind he remembered from his own childhood. They weren't scattered. They were arranged, meticulously, in a perfect widening spiral. His breath caught. How could this be here? Who would do this? There were 22 small desks. At the center of the spiral, slightly larger, was what looked like a teacher's desk. Each one was coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of gray dust, like a shroud. It was as if time had stopped in this hidden place. He walked slowly around the outer edge of the spiral, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. The silence was absolute, pressing in on him. He felt a prickling on his skin, a primal urge to turn and leave, to run back into the sunlight. But what was this? He had to know. He reached out a hand, hesitating, then lightly touched one of the small desks. The wood felt cold, almost unnaturally so. He could almost see a small child sitting there, hands folded, waiting. Waiting for what? The sheer impossibility of it was staggering. Northwood Elementary had been a fixture in the town for over 60 years. Generations of children had passed through its halls, but this room? No one knew it existed. It wasn't on any plans, old or new. It was a secret, buried deep. Why? He swept his flashlight beam across the desks again. Some had faint etchings, a heart, initials, the kind of idle graffiti kids make. But the order, the deliberate, almost ritualistic arrangement, that wasn't child's play. A chill, deeper than the subterranean air, crawled up his spine. What had happened here? His light caught something on the teacher's desk at the spiral's core. He moved cautiously towards it. A book, splayed open, its pages stiff and yellowed with age, also covered in that same thick dust. He couldn't make out the title. It was too coated. Beside it, a single, dried flower, its color long faded to a brittle brown. A wave of profound sadness washed over him, unexpected and overwhelming. This wasn't just an old storage room. This felt different. It felt like a tomb. He backed away slowly, his heart hammering. He knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his stomach, that he had stumbled upon something terrible. Something that had been deliberately hidden, deliberately forgotten. He had to call the police. This was beyond a simple worksite anomaly. He turned to leave, his light sweeping across the far wall, a section of rough concrete that looked newer, less integrated than the rest. And that's when he saw it. A crack. A significant fissure running from floor to ceiling, as if the ground had shifted, or something had impacted it from the other side. Curiosity, stronger than his unease, pulled him closer. Was there another chamber beyond this one? He leaned towards the crack, angling his flashlight. The beam penetrated the darkness, and for a moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. It looked like a pile, a heap of something soft, jumbled. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes. Were those shoes? Small shoes? He pushed gently at the edge of the crack. A piece of concrete dislodged, and fell inwards with a soft thud, widening the opening. He shone his light through again. His stomach clenched. Not just a few. Hundreds. Hundreds of children's shoes, tumbled together in a dusty, silent heap. Some were tiny, boots and sneakers, party shoes and sandals, a chaotic collection spanning decades of styles. A wave of nausea hit him. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. Leo's voice, distant and tinny, crackled over the radio. "Boss, everything okay down there?" Marcus couldn't answer. He could only stare at the impossible, horrifying sight. What in God's name was this place? He finally found his voice, hoarse and shaky. "Leo," he managed. "Call the police. Tell them to get everyone here. Now." The silence of the spiral room seemed to deepen, waiting. The news spread like a cold wind through the small town of Oakhaven. Then further, carried on the electric currents of media. A hidden room, desks in a spiral. And something else? Something the initial reports only hinted at. Something found behind a broken wall. For retired Detective Frank Miller, the words hit like a physical blow, stripping away 19 years of carefully constructed calm. He was 72 now, his movements slower, his hair white, but the memory of 2006 was as sharp and painful as if it were yesterday. Classroom 3B, Northwood Elementary. The lockdown drill that went wrong, terribly wrong. He'd been the lead investigator, the one who had to face the parents, the one who had to admit, day after agonizing day, that they had nothing. No leads, no answers. Just an empty classroom and 22 missing third graders, along with their teacher, Mr. Henderson. He remembered the call coming in that afternoon. A code yellow lockdown drill at Northwood, standard procedure. But when the all clear was given, classroom 3B didn't respond. The principal, a nervous man named Davies, had used his master key on the locked door. Miller could still see it. The room pristine, books open on desks, a half-erased math problem on the chalkboard. But no children, no teacher. It was as if they had evaporated. They'd searched every inch of that school, every closet, every crawl space they knew of. Dogs were brought in. They lost the scent right outside the classroom door. The only anomaly, the one that always gnawed at Miller, was the surveillance footage. The camera in the hallway outside 3B had inexplicably cut out at precisely 12:00 p.m., the exact moment the lockdown was initiated. It came back on an hour later, showing an empty, silent corridor. No explanations, no glitches in any other cameras. Just that one. He'd suspected a deliberate act, but could never prove it. The school's IT person insisted it was a random power surge, localized and untraceable. Miller never bought it. Now, 19 years later, this. Desks in a spiral. beneath the very school he'd searched until his eyes burned. How could they have missed it? The thought was a fresh stab of an old, familiar guilt. Sarah Vance heard the news on a small television in her quiet living room. The anchor's voice was somber, detailing the discovery at the old Northwood site. Sarah clutched the worn photograph she always kept nearby, her Emily, smiling gap-toothed in her third-grade school picture. Emily, who would be 27 now. For 19 years, Sarah had lived in a limbo of hope and despair. Every unsolved case, every unidentified remains story, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. But a part of her, the mother part, refused to let go of the possibility that Emily was out there, somewhere. This new discovery, it was different. It was tangible. It was at the school. The spiral of desks. It was too specific, too chilling. She felt a cold dread creep into her heart, a dread she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Was this it? Was this the answer she'd both craved and feared? She had to go. She had to see. Miller felt a similar pull. He dug out his old case files from a dusty box in the attic. The faded paper and typewritten notes, a testament to a case that had consumed him, then broken him, leading to his early retirement. So many dead ends. So many theories that led nowhere. The parents' grief, a constant, silent accusation. He flipped through the pages, his gaze falling on a name: Arthur Jenkins, a janitor. Quit a week after the disappearances, claimed a family emergency out of state. They tried to follow up, a perfunctory check, but he'd vanished. At the time, with no evidence linking him to anything, his departure was noted, but not heavily pursued. There were so many other, more pressing avenues. But Jenkins had access. Jenkins knew the school's layout. He remembered interviewing him briefly. A quiet, unremarkable man, kept to himself. Now, Miller wondered, what if that quietness had hidden something else? He closed the file, a new resolve hardening his gaze. He wasn't on the force anymore, but this case was still his. He had to go to Northwood. He had to see that room. He remembered something else, a tiny detail, something Jenkins had said, or hadn't said. It was like an itch in his brain, something he couldn't quite scratch. He grabbed his keys. The drive to Oakhaven would take a couple of hours. Plenty of time to think. Plenty of time for old ghosts to whisper. What was waiting for them in that hidden room after all these years? The image of the spiral, as described on the news, burned in his mind. It felt like a question, demanding an answer. And as he drove, the old forgotten detail about Jenkins started to surface, like a piece of debris rising from a dark pool. Jenkins had been asked if he'd seen anything unusual that day, anything at all. He'd simply shaken his head, eyes downcast. But there was a flicker, Miller recalled now, a hesitation so brief he'd dismissed it. What had Jenkins really seen? Or, more chillingly, what had he known? The thought spurred Miller to press down a little harder on the accelerator. He needed to get there. The police had cordoned off the entire demolition site by the time Miller arrived. He flashed his old badge and managed to talk his way through to the acting lead, a young detective named Harris, who, to Miller's surprise, actually knew who he was. "Detective Miller," Harris said, extending a hand. "Your name is all over the original case files. Legendary, in a sad way," Miller grunted. "Legendary for not solving it, you mean?" Harris had the decency to look uncomfortable. "This discovery, it's something else, sir. We're still trying to process it." He led Miller towards the excavation. The air of grim activity was palpable. Forensics teams in white suits were already on site, their movements precise and careful. The opening to the sub-basement gaped like a wound in the earth. Miller stared down into it, feeling that old, familiar coldness seep into his bones. This was where the answers lay. Or perhaps just more questions. Harris gestured to the fissure in the far wall of the newly discovered chamber. "The desks are one thing, sir," he said, his voice low. "But what we found behind that wall—" He paused. "You better see for yourself." Miller nodded, his gaze fixed on the dark opening. He knew, with a grim certainty, that whatever was in there, it was going to change everything. As he prepared to descend, he saw Sarah Vance standing at the police tape, her face a mask of anguished hope. Their eyes met for a brief second, a shared understanding of 19 years of waiting passing between them. He gave a curt nod, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Then he turned and began the descent into the earth, into the heart of a 19-year-old mystery. The chill from the chamber seemed to reach up, as if to pull him down into its secrets. He braced himself. What horrors had this ground kept hidden for so long? The silence from within the pit felt heavy, laden with unspoken stories. The sub-basement was even colder than Miller had imagined, a damp, sepulchral chill that clung to his clothes. Forensic lights cast harsh shadows, making the spiral of small desks look even more surreal, like a child's game played by phantoms. He walked the perimeter, just as Marcus Cole had, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence. Each dust-covered desk was a tiny monument to a stolen childhood. He could almost make out faint indentations where names might have been carved, ghostly traces of young lives. His gaze fell on the teacher's desk at the center, the splayed, dusty book. It felt like a scene frozen in time, a terrible tableau. Detective Harris pointed towards the jagged opening in the far wall, where a section had been carefully widened by the forensic team. "This is what the demo crew supervisor first saw. Just a glimpse," Harris said, his voice hushed despite the open air above. "We've started to excavate what's behind it." Miller approached, his old instincts kicking in, his eyes scanning every detail. The concrete of this particular wall section looked different, poured at a different time, perhaps, or deliberately broken and then roughly patched. The team had cleared a larger passage. What lay beyond was a space, not quite a room, more like a narrow, deep cavity, as if an adjoining foundation wall had collapsed or been intentionally removed, and the void behind it utilized. It was dark, and the smell was stronger here. Dust, damp earth, and that faint, sickeningly sweet chemical odor he now recognized with a lurch. Lime. Quicklime. Used to. He pushed the thought away. Forensic lights illuminated the cavity. It was filled, almost to the ceiling in the deeper parts, with shoes. Children's shoes. Hundreds upon hundreds of them. All sizes, from tiny toddler shoes to those of older children. Sneakers, sandals, scuffed leather school shoes, bright pink rain boots, a single ballet slipper. They were caked in dust and a whitish powder. Miller felt his breath hitch. This wasn't just about the missing class of 2006. This was a charnel house of memories. Each shoe an echo of a lost child. The sheer scale of it was staggering, nightmarish. This went far beyond one teacher and 22 students. This was the work of years, perhaps decades. How could something like this exist, unnoticed, beneath a school? One of the forensic technicians, a young woman with tired eyes, was carefully bagging a small sequined hair clip. It glittered mockingly in the harsh light. Suddenly, there was a choked sound from near the entrance to the sub-basement. Sarah Vance stood there, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide, with a horror that mirrored Miller's own. She had somehow slipped past the outer cordon. Before anyone could stop her, she pushed forward, her gaze fixed on the hair clip in the technician's gloved hand. Her voice was a ragged whisper, but it cut through the grim silence of the chamber. That's Emily's. I bought that for her birthday." She loved sparkles. She pointed a trembling finger. My Emily. Her favorite clip. The technician looked at Harris, who nodded grimly. Sarah sank to her knees, a low, keening sound escaping her lips, the sound of a 19-year hope finally, brutally, extinguished. The sight of that small, glittering clip, amidst the mountain of lost souls, was an unbearable confirmation. Miller felt a cold fury rise within him, directed at whoever had created this monument to stolen lives. The spiral of desks, the chamber of shoes, it was all connected. And it was far worse than he or anyone could have ever imagined. The case he thought had broken him 19 years ago was revealing itself to be something infinitely more monstrous. He looked at the hundreds of silent, dusty shoes. How many Emily Vances were represented here? How many broken-hearted parents had waited for news that never came? The thought was a crushing weight. He turned to Harris, his voice gravelly. We need to find out who built this chamber. And why. The quiet of the sub-basement seemed to press in, heavy with the unspoken tragedies of countless children. The air itself felt poisoned by the secret it had kept for so long. And the spiral of desks, sitting impassively in the center of it all, seemed to mock their efforts, a silent, orderly testament to an unimaginable chaos. The investigation into the sub-basement's origins began immediately, a frantic dive into the school's history. City archives were scoured, old building permits examined, former school employees tracked down. But the blueprints, dating back to the school's construction in the 1950s, showed nothing. No sub-basement, no hidden chambers. It was as if the space didn't officially exist, a ghost structure beneath the known building. Some of the older concrete work in the sub-basement itself suggested it might have been part of an even earlier structure, something the school was built over and around, its presence either forgotten or deliberately concealed. Who would have the knowledge and the means to adapt such a space for such a horrifying purpose? The question hung heavy in the air of the temporary command post set up near the demolition site. Miller, though officially retired, found himself drawn into the whirlwind, his old notes and memories suddenly vital. He focused on Mr. Henderson, the missing teacher, Elias Henderson. Quiet, scholarly, passionate about local history. Was it possible Henderson knew about this place from his own research, something outside official school records? Had he viewed it as a potential, albeit desperate, hiding place? Or was his presence with the children in that empty classroom something more sinister? The ambiguity was maddening. Miller shared his files on Arthur Jenkins, the janitor who had vanished. The name sparked a new, urgent search. Jenkins had been in his late 40s in 2006. If he was still alive, he'd be in his mid-60s. Detective Harris assigned a team to run nationwide checks, looking for any trace of the man. Addresses, employment records, anything. The detail Miller had recalled about Jenkins's brief interview was his almost preternatural quietness when asked about anything unusual. It wasn't just a denial, it was a complete lack of engagement, as if the question itself was irrelevant. At the time, Miller had put it down to a dull or incurious personality. Now it seemed chillingly evasive. While the search for Jenkins was underway, forensics continued their painstaking work in the sub-basement. They examined every inch of the desks. Underneath Mr. Henderson's larger desk, the one at the heart of the spiral, a technician found something. Scratched into the wood, almost invisible under the decades of dust, was a symbol. It wasn't a child's doodle. It was precise, deliberate, a circle with a dot in the center, surrounded by 3 wavy lines. Not complex, but somehow unsettling. Harris took a photo and sent it for analysis. Could this be a clue to who had used this room, or why the desks were arranged so specifically? Hours later, an email came back from a university symbologist. The symbol was obscure, but it had appeared in some local folklore collections from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, associated with an old, forgotten sect that supposedly practiced rituals in underground spaces. They were rumored to believe in guiding souls, or trapping them, through specific patterns and symbols. Spirals were also mentioned in connection with them, representing journeys into other realms or cycles of rebirth. The sect had faded into obscurity, dismissed as mere local superstition, until now. The connection, however tenuous, sent a fresh wave of unease through the investigators. Was this some kind of ritual site? The careful arrangement of the desks, the symbol, it pointed to something more than just a hiding place or a dumping ground. It suggested a purpose, a terrible, twisted logic. The overlooked detail about Jenkins that Miller had been trying to recall finally clicked into place. During that brief interview, Miller had asked Jenkins about his access to cleaning supplies, specifically lime. Standard procedure after certain types of biohazard spills. Jenkins had simply said, "We keep it stocked," but his eyes had flickered, just for a second, towards a locked supply closet in the basement, a closet that wasn't on his usual cleaning route. Miller had noted it but hadn't pushed, as there was no reason to suspect him of anything concrete at the time. Now, that flicker seemed like a beacon. What if Jenkins had access to large quantities of quicklime? The whitish powder on the shoes, the timeline for Arthur Jenkins started to come together. He'd worked at Northwood for 15 years before 2006. 15 years. The sheer number of shoes in the hidden chamber suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. This wasn't a one-time event. This was a pattern. The class of 2006 might have been his last act there. The pressure from the disappearances, the increased scrutiny, it might have spooked him into finally running. The search for Jenkins intensified. They found an old address for him, a small, run-down house on the far outskirts of Oakhaven, a place that had been sold for back taxes years ago and had stood derelict ever since. Miller and Harris decided to check it out immediately. Perhaps Jenkins had left something behind, some clue to his mindset or his whereabouts. The house was decaying, windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds. It felt like a place secrets would go to die. The air around it was heavy, still. As they forced open the front door, a gust of stale, musty air greeted them, carrying the scent of rot and old memories. What would they find in the abandoned home of a man who might be a monster? The silence inside was thick, watchful. The interior of Arthur Jenkins's abandoned house was a landscape of decay. Wallpaper peeled in long, leprous strips, furniture lay overturned and broken, and a thick layer of dust and grime covered everything. It smelled of mildew, neglect, and something else, something faintly acrid that pricked at Miller's nostrils. They moved cautiously from room to room, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The place felt like a physical manifestation of a disturbed mind. In what might have been a living room, they found a scattering of old newspapers, all dated around the time of the Northwood disappearances. The headlines stark: "School children vanish. Town prays for safe return." Jenkins had been following the coverage, it seemed. But was it with fear, or with a twisted sense of accomplishment? Then, in a small, dank bedroom at the back of the house, they found the drawings, pinned to a decaying corkboard, and scattered across a rickety table were dozens of them. They were rendered in crayon and marker, with a crude, almost childlike hand, yet the subject matter was anything but innocent. Spirals featured prominently, drawn over and over, some tight and constricting, others expanding like dark galaxies. There were crude renderings of stick-figure children, their faces blank or contorted in fear. And then Harris let out a sharp exclamation. "Miller, look at this." He was pointing to a larger sheet of paper, a hand-drawn map. It was unmistakably Northwood Elementary. And there, in the area of the West Wing, circled in red crayon, was a crudely sketched box labeled Sub B. Below it, another spiral. This was it. Jenkins knew. He absolutely knew about the sub-basement. He hadn't just stumbled upon it. He had it marked, planned. This was the mid-spike, the undeniable confirmation that Jenkins wasn't just a peripheral figure. He was central to the horror. But there was more. The map showed something else. A faint dotted line leading from the sub-B area towards what would have been classroom 3B. What did that mean? Was it an escape route? An access point? The implications were dizzying. They continued their search, a grim determination settling over them. The house felt like a tomb of secrets. In the small, crumbling basement, accessible through a warped wooden door, the air was even heavier, colder. And there, in the far corner, almost hidden behind a fallen stack of rotten shelving, they found it. A small room, barely more than a closet, its door secured with a heavy padlock, rusted shut. Harris managed to break it open with a crowbar from their kit. The door creaked open, revealing a space no bigger than a large cupboard. Inside, the sight made Miller's blood run cold. There was a single, small, child-sized cot, its thin mattress stained and torn. Next to it, a neat stack of school textbooks, third grade level. Copyright dates: 2005, 2006. And on the wall, more drawings. These were fainter, as if made by a weaker hand. More spirals. But also, a crude drawing of a tall, thin figure with no face, looming over smaller figures. The atmosphere in the tiny room was suffocating, thick with unspoken terror. Had Jenkins brought one of the children here? Or was this a place of preparation, of fantasy, the cot, the books? It was a horrifying tableau of stolen innocence. Miller felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just about a hidden room anymore. This was about a predator who had operated in plain sight, using the very place meant to protect children as his hunting ground. The silence of the abandoned house seemed to scream Jenkins's guilt. They backed out of the basement room. The image of the cot burned into their minds. The discovery here shifted everything. Jenkins wasn't just a janitor who knew about a hidden space. He was deeply, intimately involved. The question now was, how deep did his depravity run? And was he acting alone? The sheer number of shoes in the sub-basement argued against a lone operator, or at least suggested a level of activity that was hard to imagine one man sustaining for so long without any suspicion. The map, the cot, the drawings, it all painted a picture of a meticulously planned, long-term horror. The findings at Jenkins's house cast a sickening pall over the investigation. The cot, the third-grade textbooks from 2006, the crude, disturbing drawings, they all pointed to a dark obsession, a horrifying premeditation. Forensics teams descended on the derelict property, but years of neglect and decay had taken their toll. Traces of DNA were too degraded to offer clear matches to the missing children, but the circumstantial evidence was damning. The sheer existence of that hidden room in Jenkins's basement, with its single child-sized cot, was a chilling testament. Back at the command post, the atmosphere was grim. The symbol found under Mr. Henderson's desk, now linked to obscure local folklore about sex and spirals, took on a new, sinister light when juxtaposed with Jenkins's own spiral drawings. Was Jenkins part of something larger, a forgotten cult, still operating in the shadows? Or was he a lone devotee, co-opting old symbols for his own twisted purposes? An expert on fringe beliefs and local legends, a Dr. Alistair Finch was brought in. He examined the symbol, the photographs of the spiral of desks, and the drawings from Jenkins's house. He spoke of spirals as ancient symbols representing many things: journeys to the underworld, cycles of life and death, entrapment, or even a descent into madness. In some older, less savory traditions, Dr. A.T.I. Finch explained, his voice low and academic, a spiral could be a soul trap or a path for a guide. The precision of the desk arrangement is significant. It's not random. It speaks of ritual, of intent. Sarah Vance, hollow-eyed but resolute, had been shown a photograph of the symbol. A flicker of tortured recognition crossed her face. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. In the weeks before she disappeared, she was drawing spirals everywhere. On her notebooks, her homework, little ones, big ones. I asked her about it. She just said they were pretty. I thought it was just a phase, something kids do. She buried her face in her hands. Oh God, what if it meant something? What if she was trying to tell me something? The thought that her daughter might have been exposed to this symbol, this darkness, even before the disappearance, was a fresh wave of agony for her. Miller felt a pang of sympathy, mixed with a grim understanding. Children pick up on things. Had Emily seen Jenkins drawing spirals? Had he shown them to her, to other children? Were these symbols part of his grooming, his method? The focus returned to the sub-basement, to the desks themselves. The team re-examined each one, looking for anything they might have missed. Beneath one of the small student desks, number 12 in the spiral, a technician noticed a floorboard that seemed slightly loose. It was old, packed earth beneath, but this one board, probably scrounged from elsewhere, had a slight give. Carefully, he pried it up. Underneath, nestled in the shallow depression, was a single, folded piece of paper. It was brittle, yellowed with age, and smudged with dirt. With painstaking care, using tweezers, the technician unfolded it. The room, already quiet, seemed to hold its breath. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon. The colors were faded, but the image was starkly clear. It depicted a line of small stick-figure children, their arms outstretched as if holding hands. They were being led by a taller stick figure towards a dark, gaping hole in the ground. Above the hole, a large, ominous spiral was drawn in black crayon. To one side of the hole, another figure was depicted, taller, bulkier than the children, but smaller than the leading figure. This second figure was rendered entirely in shadow, a dark silhouette with no discernible features, just watching. The children in the line had simple circles for heads, but their mouths were drawn as downturned arcs. They looked scared. The leading figure, presumably representing an adult, had no discernible facial features either, but there was a sense of agency, of movement towards the dark hole. Miller leaned in closer. At the bottom of the drawing, in shaky block letters, was a single word: helper. The word hung in the air, ambiguous and chilling. Who was the helper? The one leading the children? Or the shadowy figure watching? And who had drawn this? One of the missing children, undoubtedly. A silent message, hidden for 19 years. The drawing was both a clue and a deeper mystery. It offered a glimpse into those final moments, but through a child's terrified, confused perspective. The weight of that small piece of paper, that fragile testament, was immense. It was the first direct voice from the lost. The child's drawing, depicting a helper leading children towards a dark, spiraling hole while a shadowy figure watched, sent ripples of confusion and horror through the investigative team. Was Mr. Henderson, the helper, leading the children to what he believed was safety? Or was he, too, a victim, forced to lead them into a trap? And who was the shadowy watcher? Jenkins, almost certainly. But the ambiguity of the helper label was torturous. If Henderson was the helper, did he succeed, even for a short time? Or did his efforts inadvertently lead them to a worse fate? The drawing was carefully preserved, a precious, heartbreaking piece of evidence. It recontextualized everything they thought they knew about Elias Henderson. He wasn't just a missing person. He was an active player in this tragedy, his role now deeply enigmatic. Was he a hero, a victim, or something far more complex? Investigators redoubled their efforts to understand the man. They spoke to former colleagues again, dug deeper into his personal life. One retired teacher, Mrs. Albright, who had been close friends with Henderson, recalled something he'd said in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Elias was worried, she recounted, her voice trembling slightly. He was always a bit of a worrier, but this was different. He said he kept hearing things, noises in the walls of his classroom, scratching sounds. He said he thought the old building was unsettled. She had dismissed it as stress, the ramblings of an overworked teacher with an overactive imagination. He even mentioned something about the school's history, that it was built on unhallowed ground, as he put it. He was a history buff, obsessed with local lore. I told him he was reading too many old books. Now, her dismissal haunted her. Had Henderson, with his knowledge of local history and his sensitivity to the building's strange noises, stumbled upon the sub-basement or Jenkins's activities before anyone else? This new information painted Henderson in a different light. Perhaps his research into local history had led him to discover the existence of the sub-basement, a place unrecorded on official blueprints but known in older town legends. Could he have seen it as a last resort, a place to hide the children if his fears about Jenkins, or something else sinister within the school, proved true? The theory was plausible, but it didn't explain the locked classroom door from the outside or the precise failure of the surveillance camera. Those still pointed to a deliberate act by someone with access and control, like Jenkins. The forensic team in the sub-basement continued their meticulous work. They examined the doorway leading into the chamber, the one the demolition crew had first breached. It was clear this main entrance had been sealed from the outside, and for a long time. But then, one of the technicians noticed something on the inside surface of the heavy, makeshift door, faint, desperate scratch marks. Dozens of them, concentrated around where a handle or latch might have been. They were gouged deep into the wood, as if made by fingernails, or a small, sharp object. Were these the marks of someone trying to claw their way out? Or, more chillingly, had someone been trying to claw their way in after it was sealed? The directionality was hard to determine with certainty. The discovery of the scratch marks added another layer of horror. If Henderson had led the children there for safety, what happened next? Were they trapped? Did their helper become their jailer? Or was he trapped with them? The single word on the drawing, helper, echoed in Miller's mind, becoming more ominous with each new finding. The sub-basement, once a silent tomb, was slowly giving up its secrets, each one more disturbing than the last. And the question of Arthur Jenkins loomed larger and darker. Where was he? And what other secrets had he taken with him? The hunt for him became the absolute priority. If he was alive, he held the key to unlocking the full, terrible truth of what happened in that hidden room 19 years ago. The investigation now intensely focused on the mechanics of the disappearance, particularly the lockdown drill on that fateful day in 2006. How did an entire class, plus their teacher, vanish from a locked room with the hallway camera conveniently offline? Detective Harris ordered a deep dive into the school's maintenance and IT records from that period. Buried in an archive server, an old IT incident report surfaced. It detailed a manual override of the surveillance system for the West Wing corridor, the one outside Classroom 3B. The override was traced back to a janitorial access panel located in a basement supply closet, a closet Arthur Jenkins had regular access to. This was concrete. Jenkins hadn't just benefited from a random camera malfunction. He had actively, deliberately disabled it. The timing, precisely at 12:00 p.m. when the lockdown began, was too perfect. He had created a blind spot, a window of opportunity. But what about the classroom door? It had been found locked from the outside by the principal. Standard lockdown procedure was for the teacher to lock the door from the inside and remain with the students. This discrepancy had always bothered Miller. If Mr. Henderson had initiated an evacuation, for some reason, he wouldn't have locked the door from the outside behind him. That pointed to someone else securing the room after it was empty, or trapping them inside. Or, perhaps, Henderson had led them out through an alternate route, and Jenkins, knowing the room was now empty or wanting to ensure they couldn't get back in, locked it. The sub-basement itself, how had the children and Mr. Henderson reached it? The main entrance found by the demolition crew had clearly been sealed for a very long time, and likely from the outside. There had to be another way in, a hidden passage that Henderson knew about, perhaps the one hinted at by the dotted line on Jenkins's crude map. The search teams, armed with Jenkins' map and new ground-penetrating radar equipment, began a systematic sweep of the area around and beneath Classroom 3B and the sub-basement. They focused on the wall in the sub-basement, directly opposite the spiral of desks, the wall that would have been closest to the main school building above. One section sounded hollow when tapped. Carefully, meticulously, they began to remove the cinder blocks. Behind them, not solid earth, but a narrow, dark opening. It was a tunnel, rough-hewn, barely tall enough for a small adult to crouch in, but wide enough for children to crawl through. It was shored up with rotting timbers and seemed to slope gently upwards. It was choked with dust and cobwebs, clearly unused for many years, but it was undeniably a passage. Flashlights revealed it snaked for about 30 feet, ending at what looked like a solid earth wall, but with a distinct wooden frame embedded in it. It was a trapdoor, concealed from the other side. The team supervisor radioed Harris. "We found it, a tunnel. Leads from the sub-basement right up to what we think is the crawl space directly beneath Classroom 3B. Miller, listening in, felt a grim satisfaction. This was how Henderson had moved them. During the chaos of the lockdown, with Jenkins having disabled the camera, Henderson hadn't taken the children out into the hallway. He had led them down, through a hidden trap door in his classroom, probably in a supply closet, into the crawl space, and then through this crude tunnel into the sub-basement. He must have believed it was a temporary refuge, a place no one knew, where he could keep his students safe from a threat he perceived inside the school. But if Jenkins knew about the sub-basement, as his map proved, did he also know about this tunnel? Or did he discover Henderson's desperate plan and follow them? The image of the helper leading the children into the dark hole, with the shadowy figure watching, flashed in Miller's mind. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of terrifying clarity. Henderson had tried to save them, but the Watcher had been one step ahead. The silence from the newly discovered tunnel felt ominous, as if it still held the echoes of frightened children and a desperate teacher. The discovery of the tunnel was a breakthrough. It snaked its way from the sub-basement directly to a cleverly concealed trapdoor found in the floor of what had been Classroom 3B's large supply closet. Mr. Henderson, with his knowledge of local history, and perhaps alerted by strange occurrences, must have discovered this hidden route and seen it as a desperate emergency exit. He had used the lockdown drill, a moment of sanctioned quiet and closed doors, as cover to lead his 22 students down into the earth, into what he likely believed was a temporary, unknown sanctuary. The drawing found under the desk, the helper, leading the children into the dark, spiraling hole, now seemed to depict Henderson's desperate gamble. But the shadowy figure watching, that had to be Jenkins, the horrifying truth began to coalesce. Arthur Jenkins wasn't just a disturbed loner. He was a predator who had turned the hidden underbelly of Northwood Elementary into his domain. The sub-basement was his. The hundreds of shoes were his trophies, collected over years, perhaps decades, from countless unknown victims. He had operated in the school's secret spaces, a monster hidden in plain sight. Henderson must have, through his own research or by accidentally stumbling upon some evidence of Jenkins' activities, begun to suspect the janitor. Perhaps he'd found the shoe chamber. Perhaps he'd confronted Jenkins. Or Jenkins realized he was getting too close. The lockdown drill provided Henderson an opportunity to act on his fears, to get the children away from a threat he couldn't yet prove or fully comprehend but knew was imminent. He led them through the trap door, down the tunnel, into the sub-basement. But Jenkins, methodical and cunning, must have anticipated Henderson, or quickly discovered his plan. Jenkins controlled the cameras. He knew the school's hidden ways better than anyone. He likely followed them, or was waiting for them. The locked classroom door from the outside now made sense. Jenkins sealing off their retreat, ensuring they couldn't get back up into the school. He had trapped them in the sub-basement. Mr. Henderson, the helper, had inadvertently led his charges into the spider's parlor. What happened next, in that cold, dark room, was the core of the 19-year mystery. The spiral arrangement of desks. Was it a desperate attempt by Henderson to maintain order and morale for the terrified children as they waited for a rescue that would never come? A way to conduct lessons? To keep their minds occupied in the face of unimaginable horror? Or was it something Jenkins did later? A ritualistic arrangement over their remains? A final, twisted act of possession, as suggested by Dr. Finch and the symbol under Henderson's desk? The scratch marks on the inside of the sealed main door to the sub-basement spoke of desperate attempts to escape. The sheer number of shoes found in the adjacent cavity, the quicklime, it painted a grim picture of their ultimate fate. They were never meant to leave. Jenkins had walled them in, or walled in what was left of them after days or weeks, in that cold, dark place. The broken wall where the shoes were found was likely where Jenkins had breached an older, existing cavity to create his gruesome trophy room, later sealing it up again, perhaps after adding the remains of Henderson and his class. The hundreds of shoes were a testament to a reign of terror that had gone on for years, with the class of 2006 being its final, horrifying chapter at Northwood. As the forensic team carefully sifted through the compacted earth and debris in the shoe chamber, near the area where the wall had been breached by the demolition crew, they found something metallic and corroded. It was a child's lunchbox, dented and rusted, but still latched. With extreme care, they opened it. Inside, protected from the worst of the decay by the metal, was a class photograph. 22 smiling third-grade faces surrounding their teacher, Mr. Elias Henderson, who had a kind, if slightly weary, smile. It was the class of 2006. Sarah Vance, when shown a high-resolution image, confirmed it was Emily's year. Then, the technician gently turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faint, spidery handwriting, almost illegible, but painstakingly enhanced under special lighting, were a few words. It looked like a last testament, scrawled by a weakening hand. Tried to save them. He knew. He found us. Hid this. Forgive me. E.H. Elias Henderson. His final message. a confession of his desperate attempt and his failure, a plea for forgiveness. The truth, in all its devastating simplicity, was finally revealed. Henderson was a hero, a tragic one, who had fought to protect his students until the very end, only to be overcome by a monster. The sub-basement hadn't been his choice of tomb. It had been Jenkins' trap. Miller closed his eyes, the weight of 19 years pressing down on him. The children hadn't just vanished. They had been led to slaughter by a man who should have been their protector's shadow, a man who walked the halls with them every day. The note on the back of the class photograph was a devastating period at the end of a 19-year-long sentence of uncertainty. Elias Henderson had tried. He had fought. He had failed. Arthur Jenkins, the quiet janitor, was the monster who had lurked beneath the everyday surface of Northwood Elementary. The search for Jenkins, which had been frantic, now took on an air of grim finality. He had to be found, not for clues, but for a reckoning. But the world, it seemed, had already delivered its own kind of justice, albeit a blind and unsatisfying one. Records eventually surfaced. Arthur Jenkins, age 51, had died 7 years after the Northwood disappearances, in 2013. He'd been living under an assumed name in a small town several states away. His death was mundane, almost anticlimactic, hit by a delivery truck while crossing the street. An accident. No confrontation, no confession, no chance for the families to face him. He had simply ceased to exist, taking the full, horrifying scope of his secrets with him. The hundreds of shoes in the sub-basement chamber remained largely anonymous, a silent, heartbreaking testament to decades of potential victims, children whose disappearances were perhaps never linked, or never reported, or who were simply forgotten by time. Each pair was a ghost story without a name. For Sarah Vance, the discovery of the lunchbox, the photograph, and Henderson's heartbreaking note brought a terrible, crushing certainty. The 19 years of clinging to faint, impossible hope dissolved into a tidal wave of fresh grief, yet beneath it, there was also a strange, bitter kind of peace. She finally knew. Emily hadn't been abandoned. She had been fought for. Her teacher had tried to be her helper. It was a sliver of solace in an ocean of pain. She clutched Emily's sparkling hair clip, now a sacred relic, and wept for the little girl who loved sparkles, and for the teacher who had tried to shield her from the darkness. Detective Miller, too, found a dark, uneasy closure. The case that had defined and broken his career was solved, its central mystery laid bare, but the victory was hollow. The children were gone. Their voices, their laughter, their futures, all extinguished in that cold, hidden room. The knowledge of Jenkins's banal end, unpunished by the law, left a taste of ash in his mouth. Justice felt incomplete, cheated. The demolition of Northwood Elementary was permanently halted in the area of the sub-basement. The ground was deemed consecrated by tragedy. The spiral of desks, the tunnel, and the chamber of shoes were meticulously documented, then sealed. It would become a tomb, a subterranean memorial to the lost children of Classroom 3B and all the unknown others. The spiral of small, dusty desks would remain undisturbed, an eternal, silent testament to innocence betrayed, and a teacher's desperate, failed courage. The town of Oakhaven would forever bear the scar of Northwood's hidden secret. The school, a place intended for learning and safety, had harbored an unimaginable darkness for decades, its foundations literally built over a place of horror. The story became a grim reminder of the unseen monsters that can walk among us, hidden behind ordinary faces in ordinary places. The resolution was bittersweet, a tragedy understood but not undone. The loss remained, profound and echoing, a disturbing realization of the fragility of safety and the deep shadows that can lie beneath the most familiar surfaces. The quiet horror of what one man had done for so long, in secret, would linger for generations. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.